Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now we're living in very strange times. If you're at home, which I'm sure you are watching this, and I hope you are bearing up under what are extraordinary circumstances, over the coming weeks we at the New Culture Forum will continue doing our broadcasts. We're going to continue doing our interviews with So What You're Saying Is, and indeed our discussions with Counterculture, only with slightly technical tweaks, as you will see. I'm delighted that my guest this week is the eminent and award-winning historian Tom Holland. Tom is the author of numerous books. He's also the translator of classical texts. He has presented documentaries on television. He's a presenter of Radio 4's Making History. His most recent book came out last year. It's called Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, and it's about how Christianity has informed our value system and our structures of our society right up to the present time. Thank you very, very much for coming on, Tom. Thank you. Beautiful display of books there. How are you?
No, I'm joining the trend, but showing up the cases.
How are you bearing up?
Well, I have to say that by and large, my life hasn't completely changed.
Right.
I missed the finishing a translation of Suetonius for Penguin Classics, which I was meant to have handed in at Christmas. And for various reasons, my life's been very busy.
Yeah.
So in a way, I'm quite grateful for the opportunity that this is giving me to just sit down and absolutely nail it. Okay. Having said that, obviously, I'm starting to really want to get out now.
Yes, exactly. I want to start actually, Tom, because you wrote a fascinating piece, I thought, in the Sunday Times quite recently, when you were looking at the various plagues that had come in the ancient world, particularly in Athens and Rome. And you were talking, I think the title of the piece was that, you think it's bad now, what it was like then. I mean, I wonder whether, in fact, there are any parallels with what happened, for example, under Pericles in ancient Rome and in Athens, rather, and then also in Rome. Are there any parallels with what we're going through today?
Well, the great thing about Thucydides' account of the plague of Athens, which is the kind of primal account of the impact of an epidemic, is that he analyses what the plague, whatever it was, probably form of typhus, typhoid fever, on the individual. And Thucydides knew all about this because he himself had it and had recovered from it. But what he also does is to recognise that there is a kind of political mythology, that the impact of the disease has a terrifying impact on the democracy and on the social structures of Athens. And so that also is why he includes it in his history of the Peloponnesian War, because he sees in the long run that the impact of the plague is measurable in the effect that it has ultimately on the way that Athenians' society functions, the strategy that it pursues in the war, and ultimately, although this is unspoken. Anyway, I think to that degree, the way in which the impact of this disease is not just on individuals, but on the whole of society, that is something that was absolutely understood by the classical authors as well.
What actually?
Having said that, the point of the article was hopefully a mildly encouraging one, which is that terrible though the impact of COVID-19 is on individuals and on our society generally, its impact is nothing compared to that of plagues back in classical antiquity, and I hope that offers some faint reassurance.
Can you just explain a little bit, because a lot of people watching will not know necessarily very much about that plague, the Athens plague. I mean, how did it come about, and what was the result of it? Can you just tell us a bit about it?
Well, the context for it is the Peloponnesian War, which is the great war between Athens, the maritime democracy, and Sparta, the insular crabbed, xenophobic military power. So kind of the classic war between an elephant and a whale. Yeah. And the Athenian strategy, based on the fact that it's a great naval power and a great trading power, is that the Athenian people will hide behind their walls. let the Spartans move into Attica, burn the crops, and then kind of like a wave breaking and retreating before a great rock, go back to Sparta. And for the first year this works, but the second year plague arrives, and it's been a distant rumour in Athens for several months. It's appeared in Egypt, it's appeared in the Persian Empire, and then it appears in Piraeus, the Athenian port, and it spreads up. And its impact is devastating because it's enhanced by the fact that Athens is crowded with refugees from the countryside all around. Right. And what is, of course, also fascinating from our point of view is that Athens, unlike Sparta, is a very globalized state. It's the main trading power in the Eastern Mediterranean. It has trade links with Egypt and the vast hinterland of diseases that Africa contains. It has trade links with Persia, and then beyond that, the vast hinterland of diseases that are contained within Eurasia. So this is something that over the centuries that follow will increasingly buffet the world of the Mediterranean, and particularly under Rome, because what Rome does is to unite the whole of the Mediterranean under a unitary power, and Rome, even more than Athens, has trade links with both Central Africa and with Central Eurasia. And that means that all kinds of terrifying germs and diseases hit the Roman Empire in ways that have incalculable effects.
What was the nature of these plagues? I mean, compared to what we're talking about now, I mean, were they sort of like Ebola, for example, or what was the nature of them?
There's a plague in the mid-3rd century, which is known as Cyprian's plague, after the church father Saint Cyprian, who became Bishop of Carthage and who wrote about its impact and about its effect. And to the degree that it's possible to work out what a disease was from very ancient accounts, people have seriously suggested that this perhaps was a form of Ebola. The descriptions sound familiar: blood kind of coming out of the eyes, limbs falling off at the end. I mean, horrible way to die. And there seems to have been a recognition that corpses themselves were highly infectious, which of course is a part of Ebola. So that's quite a well-grounded theory.
Right. How did you said that the most important thing is how it changed? For example, we were talking about Athenian society and now Roman. What were the changes? Was it collapse? I mean, did these societies collapse?
Well, Thucydides says of Athens that nothing had a greater impact on the course of the war than the plague, and by that he meant that the survivors had a kind of giddy lack of patience. They felt that because they had survived, therefore in a way nothing could harm them. And so this leads them to increasingly rash strategies, in which the culminating rash strategy is an invasion of Sicily, which ends up wiping out large quantities of Athenian ships and men, and basically dooms Athens to defeat by Sparta. And so Thucydides absolutely traces this to the kind of long-term impact of the plague, which had happened decades before. In Rome, there are 3 great plagues. There's Cyprian's plague that I mentioned. There's a plague earlier, before that, at the end of the 2nd century, called the Antonine plague, because it hits in the reign of the Antonines, Marcus Aurelius. And then the plague of Justinian, which happens in the 6th century. Each of these have a kind of cumulative effect. The Antonine plague comes from the east. It seems to come from Persia. It sweeps the whole of the Roman Empire, and although it doesn't bring the empire down, it leaves it vulnerable to the further shock that is the plague of Cyprian. And Cyprian's plague, insofar as we can tell, kind of unleashes a meltdown of Roman society. And the reason we have to say, so far as we can tell, is because we don't really have very good sources for that period, and that may be, again, a reflection of the impact of the plague. But to the extent that we do know what's going on, we know that the Roman Empire essentially implodes. times. Right. This is a period of increasing anarchy. Emperor butchers emperor, often within the space of a few months. The empire fragments into several portions, and it's only with a huge effort of will that it's put together again. And when it emerges at the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century, the Roman Empire is a very different beast. It's a beast that is much more muscle-bound, much more top-heavy, it's again, in the context of what we're talking about, how to fight COVID, it ends up as a kind of surveillance society.
Yeah.
There are tax collectors, there are soldiers, there are spies everywhere. And this in turn means that in the 5th century, when again there is a kind of process of fragmentation, the western half of the empire is unable to cohere, and it splinters and collapses. That leaves the eastern half of the empire, which under the rule of its greatest emperor Justinian, looks as though it's making a comeback. Justinian sends military expeditions to win back Africa, to win back Italy, to win back chunks of Spain even. But then in 541, plague hits Alexandria and spreads to Constantinople, and from Constantinople spreads westwards, ultimately as far as Britain and Ireland, and eastwards into the Persian Empire. And that again has a completely devastating impact. It's now almost certainly accepted that this was bubonic plague, so the first manifestation of the plague that in the 14th century would lead to the death of perhaps a third of Europe. And so that's the scale of casualties that we're almost certainly talking about in the context of the 6th century. And the impact of that on the great urban empires of Constantinople and of Persia is absolutely devastating, because the impact on urban centres is much greater than it is on those in the peripheries, particularly in the desert peripheries. Yeah. And so I think it's entirely reasonable to see the collapse of both the Persian and the Roman empires before what will become Islam as, in part at least, due to the impact of the plague in the 6th century. So these are, world-shaping events.
Do you think that when we come right up to date, or should I say at least in historical terms up to date, to, for example, the Spanish flu after the First World War, do you think that there are any parallels between what's happening now and that, for example? I mean, we hear that journalists particularly at the moment, are talking about pandemics and plagues almost, interchangeably. But from what you're saying, it seems to me that what we're having at the moment is not exactly a plague in that sense. But the Spanish flu was.
I'd have to say, which historians always do, that it's not my period.
Right.
I have no great knowledge of the Spanish flu or anything like that.
Right.
What I would say in the context of the classical plagues is that they are an index of globalization. Yes. And in a sense, what's happening goes back to the Bronze Age, which is the first period where you start to get large settled communities in the forms of cities and trade routes linking them to other areas of the world, perhaps with animals where there are diseases are capable of making crossover. And you get trace elements of plagues in, it's there in the Iliad, it's there in the Old Testament. The reason why they're so devastating in the context of the Roman Empire is that the empire exists on the kind of the crossroads of these two great breeding grounds of plague, Central Africa and Central Asia. Yes. And in a way, their impact is so devastating precisely because there's nothing like them has ever been seen before, nothing on that scale. Yeah. And again, the Black Death is a kind of another reverberation of that. Since the era of authentic globalization, the knitting together of nations across the entire world, what's happening now is clearly something that's been waiting to happen for the same reasons that plague hit the Roman Empire. And I suppose that in a way we can count our blessings that it hasn't been as bad as it might be.
Right.
And in a sense, it's a kind of warning shot across our bows that perhaps the next pandemic will be something where far more people die.
Yes.
Yeah, lessons from history are not. I'm trying to offer a cheering take drawing from history, but then there is also that negative one that you kind of, it's like sitting on the San Andreas Fault. You're waiting for the big one. Yeah. It's going to come.
I know that I've spoken to enough historians to know that you hate being asked to give predictions, as it were, and to look into the crystal ball. But what do you see as being, broadly, as far as we can tell so far, the general changes that might happen to our society as a result of this? I mean, a lot of people are speculating at the moment. I'm seeing more and more articles about the way in which this will fundamentally change us. But how do you see things going forward politically?
Well, you're right. I'm not remotely qualified to. I'm no more qualified to offer prognostications than anyone else. But having said that, since you've asked me, there are kind of two alternatives. One, and both of which are sanctioned by historical exemplars. The first is that it won't really change anything very much. Right. The impact of the Spanish flu is measurable. In fact, basically everyone forgot about it. People are only talking about it now because of what we're going through. Right. The impact of the current epidemic is so seismic precisely because we have no vague memory of the Spanish flu. Yeah. And it's perfectly possible, I'd have thought, that this will come and go and then everything will kind of go back to normal. Against that, I think we have to wait and see what the impact of this is going to be on countries that are much less fitted to cope with it than we are. It's clear that the Asian countries like South Korea, Singapore, precisely because they have already they've been through the mill of SARS, so they are ready for it. So they are best qualified. So they, I think, are going to be the kind of their soft power status, let alone their economic status, in the wake of this is going to be enormously enhanced. I think that this is going to be very damaging to the prestige and indeed the kind of self-confidence of Western powers. It looks as if the United States might be in considerable trouble. Right. I would have thought that Trump will lose the election now. But what will the impact be on countries that don't have the healthcare systems that are currently? I mean, our healthcare systems, they may be in the process of being overwhelmed, but we have healthcare systems. What about countries that don't have any like that? I'm thinking particularly of countries that are suffering massive stress. So Venezuela, what's the impact there going to be? Yes. What's the impact going to be on Iran? That seems to have gone completely silent. Yes. Are we really meant to think that it's just stopped? I didn't think so. You can see all kinds of tremors building up there, perhaps on Saudi Arabia. I mean, we don't know. So I would have thought that it will be an amplifier on where there are stresses. It will amplify those stresses.
Do you think? I mean, do you? Again, sort of looking at the situation at the moment, do you sort of tend to go with one view, which is that basically this is going to strengthen the re-emergence of the nation state, for example, or do you think that is sort of an exaggeration? I mean, many people are looking and saying, well, look, borders have arrived again and the EU appears to be relatively irrelevant in this situation. I mean, these are quite big developments, are they not?
Well, I mean, it seems to be so keeper. Every country has essentially drawn back on its own resources. Borders have gone up, and it's clearly not. It's not working out well for the European Union. It's coming under enormous stress, and I think that kind of pan-national organisations like the World Health Organization seem to have been behaving disgracefully. Again, I'm not qualified. I offer no specialist opinion on that, but purely from reading about it, it really doesn't seem to have measured up at all. So it may well be that in the short term, there will be a sense that every country is going to want to make sure that it has access to the kind of resources that a country like Britain simply hasn't had. Yes. I would have thought that in the wake of this, we're going to want to do that. Equally, however, I would have thought that the long-term effect will be to recognise that we are now we are a global society, and for instance, putting up the drawbridge against, say, if Africa goes into meltdown with this, that's not going to help Europe. So there's going to have to be some. Again, I'm aware I'm not giving you a straight answer, but I think that there are going to be contrary stresses here. There will be the instinct to draw up the drawbridge. Equally, there's going to be a consciousness of the fact that we can't really afford to do that because the world's ability to cope with this pandemic is going to be as strong as its weakest link.
Yes. You've just written a book, or last year, it was a very well received book, Tom, called Dominion, as I said in the introduction, which is about the influence of Christianity essentially on our modern societies and how it's all encompassing, and in a way that maybe we didn't fully appreciate before. I wonder whether you could explain to us, because you've written extensively about Islam too, and I wonder whether there is any difference, or what are the big differences in the big religions in the world in their response to, for example, what is happening now? Would they look at these things in a different way?
Well, the thesis of Dominion, as you say, is that people in the West are much more Christian perhaps than many of them would think. And the analogy that I was thinking of when I was writing the book was that we're goldfish, and the waters that we swim in our goldfish bowl are Christian ones. Then I watched the HBO series about Chernobyl, and was struck by a different metaphor, which is that in that show, many of your viewers will have seen it. There's a scene where two of the characters are right up close to the leaking reactor, and you can see the radiation coming out because it's ionising the air. But of course, the impact of this leak in the long run is invisible. You can't see it if you're in Kiev or in Scandinavia or in a sheep farm in Cumbria, but it's still affecting you. And that's really how I see that the impact of Christianity is that, not to say that it kills you or makes your hair fall out or anything like that, but that if you're up close to it, of course you can see it. If you're looking at a cathedral, if you're contemplating Bunyan, of course Christianity's impact is absolutely in your face, but its impact is also there even if you may not see it. And so, for instance, the question of the idea of world religions, the idea that there are things called religions, this may seem a given. You may just assume, well, of course there are things called religions, there have always been things called religion. But in fact, this is an example of the way in which, kind of like, you don't have to see radioactivity to be affected by it. Yeah. You don't have to be aware of Christianity's impact for it to affect the way you think, because in fact, the idea of world religions is a very, very Christian one, because it's Christianity that provides the prototype for a religion. And the reason that it does that is that by the 18th century, for complicated theological and historical reasons, Christians in Europe have arrived at a very, very strange and culturally distinctive notion, which is that there is a space called the secular, which is assumed to be neutral, a kind of neutral space. And then there are things at tangents to the secular called religions. And religions are what you believe in. They're what your personal relationship with the deity. And so this is a way of understanding society that Christians export with them. Kind of like, people carrying the virus, if you like. You take it with you. You don't even realise you're taking it with you. Yeah. And so for instance, the British arrive in India, and they call it Hindustan. They call the inhabitants of Hindustan Hindus, and the British understandably say, well, what is the religion of the Hindus? But it's a bad question, because the Hindus don't have a religion, because religion is an entirely weird, culturally distinctive 18th century way of seeing things back, based in Europe. But because the British are governing India, and because Indians increasingly come to speak, or at least elite Indians come to speak English, without even being aware of it, they come to absorb this idea that there is something called the secular, and that there are things called religions. And the notion, the word that the British invent, Hinduism, is something that Indians themselves come to take on. They come to think of themselves as belonging to a religion called Hinduism. And by the time the British go, the leaders of the independence movement in India are perfectly happy. Indeed, it's fundamental to their vision of India's future to think of it as being a secular republic. And to this day, India is a secular state. Yes. And the fact that it's a secular state is a kind of witness to Christianity's impact. And in the book, I cite an Indian scholar who brilliantly sums it up. He says that Christianization proceeds in two ways. It proceeds through conversion, that's obvious, but it also proceeds through secularization. And so when you look at countries that in no way would you think of as being Christian, India, Japan, Turkey, all these countries define themselves as secular, and so to that degree, they've been Christianized.
Yes.
And I think that the degree to which Muslims think of themselves as belonging to a religion called Islam is also reflective of the way in which Christianity has impacted Islam. And so in a way, that's what I wanted to write about, was the way in which Christianization has had this almost invisible impact in the world, and it's had an impact on people who would absolutely not think of themselves as Christians, not just atheists, but people who would see themselves as belonging to very different traditions.
In our sort of society, people who are proudly secular don't think that there's any religious context at all to their secularism, do they? I mean, they think it's something that almost arrived sort of out, sort of strange kind of humanism arrived almost out of nowhere.
Well, because secularism essentially is what provides the basis for our multicultural societies in all their different forms, be it the French, the British, even the American forms. It's pretty important to the successful functioning of secularism that it is thought to be neutral, that it is thought to have just kind of magically materialised, like a sunny day or something. It's just there. If you start asking yourself too closely, where does this idea come from, then you have no choice but to recognise that it's deeply, deeply rooted in profoundly Christian assumptions. And that's why it's much easier for Christians and for people who come from a Christian cultural background to just accept that the idea of the secular is something that everyone should take it for granted, than it is, say, for Muslims or for Jews. And in a way, this has been evident from the emergence of the kind of idea of the laïcité in France, which is the first overtly militantly secular society. Under the Revolution, Jews are allowed, they're given citizenship of the French Republic, but there is a kind of proviso, and that is that they are no longer allowed to think of themselves as belonging to a people, which is what they'd always previously done. They always thought of themselves as the people of Israel. They never thought of themselves as belonging to a religion called Judaism. Judaism is a Christian neologism. It's a word that Christian thinkers had basically coined in the 2nd century AD. No Jew had ever used it. But over the course of the 19th century, the quid pro quo for Jews becoming citizens of European secular states is that they have to accept that they belong to something called Judaism. And so both Reform and Orthodox Judaism, as it emerges over the 19th century, are kind of different attempts to construct a kind of model of Jewish practice that can correspond to the Christian concept of a religion. And the same kind of thing is now happening with Muslims, who likewise face a kind of similar dilemma, that they are given by Western states freedom of religion. Yes, they can practice Islam as a religion, but that requires them to accept that Islam is a religion, that it is something distinct and abstractable from the secular. And that's something that most Muslims in the West are perfectly happy to accept, but there are, of course, a minority who do not accept that, and it's not surprising that they don't accept it, because basically they're being asked to make Islam into something that is more Christian, and inevitably that imposes stresses. And so the lure of the idea of a kind of global ummah, the idea of a caliphate, the idea of this kind of global polity, where Islam is not a religion, that it is something far profounder than that. It is part of the fabric of people's lives, which is what Islam always was until the 19th, 20th centuries. The appeal of that is obvious, and I think explains why the clarion call of the caliphate, the clarion call of joining a global ummah was so profound.
Do you believe yourself, actually, Tom? I mean, are you sort of, you've written the book. The implication, perhaps I'm wrong, tell me, but is that influence of Christianity on the whole has been quite a positive thing. But do you therefore, do you believe in God yourself? Would you call yourself a Christian?
Well, the reason that the influence of Christianity, I think, is liable to seem a positive one is because our standards of what are good and bad are basically Christian. Right. And so where Christianity is judged and found wanting, so the Crusades, violent, the Inquisition, brutal killing of innocent people. Why do we think war is bad? Why do we think the killing of innocent people and the torture to death is bad? Because Christ told Peter to put up his sword and said turn the other cheek. That is the ideal of Christian pacifism. And why is the idea that inquisitors might torture to death innocent people so offensive to us? Because the central image of Christianity is a man tortured to death under the implement of torture. So even when people condemn Christianity, they do it for deeply, deeply Christian reasons. And essentially what I have come to realise, and the reason I wanted to write the book, was that pretty much everything I think and believe, by the standards of a kind of exacting rationalism, is mythical. Human rights do not exist. There is no obligation to show compassion or charity to those who are less fortunate than you. There is no reason why bloodthirsty conquest shouldn't be celebrated. There's no objective reason why racism shouldn't be celebrated. The reason that I want to hold to the values that I have don't reflect human nature, don't reflect kind of objective reality. They reflect the huge weathering effect of centuries and millennia of history upon me and upon the society in which I've been raised and the family in which I've been raised. And therefore I essentially have the choice of jettisoning all completely, becoming embracing a kind of existentialism or whatever, or accepting that myths can be true. And in the end of the book, I quote Tolkien, who basically says this, that myths can be true. And I suppose that's where I am. If I'm asked, well, where was God when the asteroid hit the planet at the end of the Cretaceous? Where is God in the vast inky depths of space? Then I can't really believe in God. But if I think, what do I believe? What do I value? What do I find the most compelling narrative that I know? It is the kind of the passion and resurrection. And the experience of reflecting and thinking about it over 4 years and more has been to open up to me the degree to which all that I believe as a kind of secularist, as a humanist, is simply a watery and anemic version of Christian myths. And that those Christian myths are so potent, so beautiful often, so illumined by the thinking of minds immeasurably greater than mine, certainly, that I feel it almost a kind of arrogance not to accept that I exist by virtue of these myths, and that therefore my relationship towards them cannot simply be one of doubt and repudiation. So to that extent, it's obviously complicated, incredibly complicated, and you may feel that I'm not giving you a straight answer.
No.
That perhaps I'm not giving you a straight answer is because I think it's too complicated for a straight answer, and that in that I think that I'm not in any way unusual. I actually think that the relationship of people in the West to this Christian inheritance is more complicated than most people think, and the moment you do stop to seriously consider it and contemplate it, you have no choice but to accept that.
Yes, the reason I ask is that this is something that bothers me occasionally, and I've had conversations about it where I tend not intellectually to believe in God, but nevertheless, I've rather settled on this phrase cultural Christian. Do you know? I don't know whether that means anything to you.
Yes, it does. And I think that is based. I mean, I think you don't have to accept it to be culturally Christian. I think by and large the West is profoundly culturally Christian.
Yeah.
And I think furthermore that the kind of the non-belief in a culturally Christian society is in itself a kind of belief.
Yes.
Because it's defined by what you don't believe in.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's the kind of it's the negative of a photo, but you don't have the negative without the original photo.
Right.
So in that sense, secularism, humanism, whatever you want to call it, remains a belief system. There's nothing obvious about it. It requires commitment. It requires belief. It has priesthoods. It has it has heretics. It is in a way a kind of if you think of the medieval church, which is born in a kind of great cultural revolution in the 11th century, and then Protestantism, which is born in a very similar cultural process of Reformation in the 16th century. What is now the kind of the dominant way of understanding the world is the product of the 18th century and its kind of reverberation through the Enlightenment, French Revolution, the 60s, and so on. But I think that I'm more than culturally Christian. I think that there is a kind of nexus, a kind of intersection of the Venn diagram between belief and disbelief,
right,
where I find myself currently. I do believe in the Christian myth. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, right.
I think the Lord Jesus Christ rose on the third day. Well, I'm not sure, but I kind of believe that there is a power in that myth that goes beyond simply.
Yes.
Simply kind of the rationalist ability to explain it.
Do you think, this is a very, very big question, but do you think that situations that we're going through at the moment, say for example with COVID-19, do you think they tend to give a boost to religion, or do they tend to diminish it in the long term?
I think that that Christianity's power is founded on its ability to provide comfort to those who are suffering, ultimately. I think that was evident right from the start. The idea that it wasn't Caesar who was the Son of God. It was someone who had suffered the most humiliating death imaginable. Had suffered the death of a slave, and therefore there's a kind of depth charge there which burns very slowly throughout history, but containing the idea that perhaps the slave is closer to God than the king. And this manifests itself in times of extreme stress, of which plagues are absolutely an example, in offering reassurance to people that there is love for those who are suffering terribly, and there is hope, and there is purpose. Now, whether theologically you can provide sanction for that is a notorious problem. But I think it's indisputable. Looking, for instance, at the testimony of Cyprian, the bishop watching people die very, very horribly all around him, there seems to be no doubt that Christianity is better able to provide people in suffering those terrors with a sense of hope and of purpose, a sense that there is love for them from their fellow men as well as from God. Because one of the things that Christianity seems to inspire in a way that it doesn't among other people suffering from this plague is a readiness to go and help those who are suffering. Yes. So I think for all those reasons, you might think that plagues or wars or earthquakes or whatever would get people to question the idea of an all-powerful, all-good God. Famously it did for Voltaire and the impact, aftermath of the destruction of Lisbon in the earthquake. But actually, it perhaps counterintuitively, it seems to work in the other way, that it's when you feel the profoundest grief, it's when you're in the valley of the shadow of death, that perhaps that you most want what Christianity can offer. And so I'll be interested to see what the whether it leads people to lose faith or to gain faith, or I don't know. It's interesting to see.
Tom, it's great to talk to you about this. I have been looking back at your output, which is prodigious, extraordinary. All the things that you've done from the very early novels you were writing right through to now, and I noticed that you were writing an opera. You're writing an opera about Cleopatra. I was wondering, now that we have, I know you've told us that you've got your work cut out as it is, but are you sort of progressing with that at the moment, or?
Well, it's done. It's done.
It's done.
Yes, it's a kind of operatic mamma mia. Because I've got two friends who are both very musical, far more musical than I am. They're married. One is a singer. One is a director. And we've been kind of working on various ideas for musicals for years and years. And our most recent one was we were going to do a musical about Nero as a rock star. Right. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could just chuck in a bit of Monteverdi into it, or Handel's Agrippina. And then we said, well, actually, there's no reason why we couldn't. No. It's out of copyright. And from that, we kind of the idea spiraled that let's do tell the story of Cleopatra, but using the most famous arias imaginable from 19th century high opera. And so that's what we're doing.
Oh, great!
And it's been showcased at the Albert Hall.
Really? When would that be?
And so that was last spring, and now we're in the process of talking to all kinds of people, and it's just kind of building up to a head, and then coronavirus hit, so it's all gone back into stasis again. But fingers crossed.
Well, great. So it will at some stage be performed.
Yeah, God or ISIS or whoever willing. Yeah.
Tom, thank you very, very much. It's great. Thank you for joining us and for giving us so much time. And well, look, I hope stay strong and stay well. Thanks very much for watching. So what you're saying is, look forward to seeing you next time. Please do keep subscribing, won't you? And also do stay safe and stay well. Thank you.